Hello, and welcome to another episode of Exposing Post-Media Propaganda. Now, I have to be honest, I actually filmed the reading for this video all the way back on Canada Day, July 1st, which is a bit of a while ago. And by the look of it, the video is actually going to be coming out on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada, September 30th, which kind of feels appropriate in some ways. Because today I'm going to be talking about an article, an op-ed piece by Jamie Sarkonak, and in which she moans and complains about the fact that the city of Vancouver has renamed one of the streets in that city. Recently, Sarkonak used her platform, which is owned by the US billionaire hedge fund company Chatham Asset Management, I think it's important to remember that, to cry about the decision to rename a street in Toronto. Because there's nothing more dangerous and disruptive for snowflakes like Jamie Sarkonak than acknowledging and making amends for harms done to Indigenous people. So Sarkonak starts her melodramatic moaning in the first sentence, which is regular for her. She goes to say, "The city of Vancouver describes its new street, its new name for Trutch Street." And now, granted, I cannot pronounce this name. I'm not denying it. It is a number of letters in a row that don't typically fit the traditional alphabet. So I can't pronounce it. But she says it is a gift, but it is more like a curse. On Tuesday, City Council unanimously voted for the change, condemning 100 or so residents to a lifetime of adversarial grief. Joining them in suffering will be countless drivers who make their way down the route, delivering, visiting, and otherwise trying to get from A to B. The new name means Musqueam View, in Musqueam. But the city itself admits that nobody is likely to be able to read it in its letter salad form. Quote, "With no fluent speakers left, this street name is a landmark moment for," I cannot pronounce this, revitalization, notes a webpage about the change. And then that word beginning in H refers to Musqueam's traditional language. It will replace the name of Joseph Trutch, 1826 to 1904, BC's first lieutenant governor, who, among other things, reduced the sizes of Indigenous reserves and denied the existence of some earlier treaties. So this is a bad guy, a guy who was, dealing in bad faith with Indigenous people and denying treaties. So Jamie goes on to say, that remark by the city contained an important admission. The purpose of changing the name of pronounceable Trutch Street into something indecipherable at 40 kilometers per hour is political. The goal is to involve the local population in a moral exercise at the cost of their comfort and safety. Indeed, not even the Musqueam, who insisted on this visual obstacle course, according to Deputy City Manager Armin Amrolia. So the local Musqueam people wanted this change, are going to be capable of reading it. So they say that Sarkonak says that not even the Musqueam will be able to read it. Beyond signaling solidarity against colonialism, impeding the passage of Vancouverites and offending the local Squamish nation, it's a functionally useless sign. I would say, besides her propaganda work, Sarkonak is functionally useless, but let's go on. Ad hominems aside, let's go on. Sarkonak goes on to cry about how this change will supposedly make life harder for first responders and services like Canada Post, which, let's be honest, Sarkonak no doubt believes should be privatized. And the Canada Revenue Agency, which I'm sure Sarkonak would love to doge. But she admits that the previous English street name will still be used for emergency services. It's actually not going away. She says, to address these concerns, the city has suggested a second set of unofficial signs that read Musqueam View Street, though it's unclear whether that solution has been finalized. Emergency mapping systems will use the unofficial English name, but it won't appear in the bylaw, which will use the official name instead. And I mean, like, it's worth pointing out that there's a number of countries like New Zealand that use Indigenous words and language in their street signs. Oh God, New Zealanders, they're having a terrible time down there. But she goes on to claim, It's no small matter to expand the letters that a system can use. Even for this newspaper, our designer advises me, this article will be a headache to print due to the digital acrobatics involved. Yes, 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 yes. A billionaire-funded, U.S. hedge fund funded, the largest publishing company of news in this country is going to struggle due to digital acrobatics. They clearly didn't. It's right here in the article. I'll leave a link in the description. You can see it yourself. Perhaps Vancouver, she says, believes it can force decolonization on others by using the script of what is functionally a dead language. It is clear that easy communication is no longer the priority. This street in Vancouver is being transformed into a learning opportunity to force upon commuters, similar to a grade 1 classroom with labeled staplers and doors, as part of a wider trend. She's just insulting. Like comparing the process of anti-colonial renaming of street signs to labeling objects in schools. This woman is patronizing beyond belief. It's just ridiculous. How does she have a job? She's a propagandist. That's how she has a job. Toronto decided to rename its Woodsy Park to Ethanonhawastinen Park in 2019, resulting in a very awkwardly named library branch. I'm not going to deny it. You heard me struggle with that pronunciation. But here's the thing, Jamie. None of us have learned this pronunciation. We've been purposefully not taught. We've been purposely not taught these things. That's why we can't pronounce them. Edmonton, she goes on, Edmonton in 2020 switched its wards over to from the numbers to indigenous words like Ipihukanipiatsi, which and I butchered that, but again, I have never learned how to say that word, which I imagine very few residents can spell or pronounce without seeing the word in front of them. But if they were taught, they would be able to. Vancouver has elementary schools named, I don't know how to pronounce that, and there's two of them. A guaranteed recipe for confusion. Again, confusion if we're not taught. But you don't want to teach us, Jamie. You don't want to teach us. You want us to live in fear and hate. Municipalities, she goes on to say, are entities. This is my favorite bit about this whole thing. Municipalities are not entities that are set out in the Canadian Constitution. They only exist because provincial legislators say so. And by that same power, provincial legislators can limit what these cities can do. The same goes for school boards. So we're going to limit the independent power of municipalities and school boards. Okay. She goes on to say, if names are getting out of hand, provincial ministers can limit the changing of historic names. They can put character limits on new street, neighborhood, and school titles to keep them to a reader-friendly length. And they can ban the use of special non-English and non-French characters to keep a city's addresses readable by humans and databases alike. Okay, so what we should do is use the power of provincial governments to stop what the municipalities and cities are doing? That doesn't sound very democratic, Jamie. That sounds a bit authoritarian. She goes on to say, more than a cultural issue, it's an accessibility issue. Canada has official languages to prevent its people from suffering Tower of Babel incidents. What does that mean, Jamie? Are you an Islamophobe too? Yes, of course you are. Of course you're an Islamophobe. If city officials have forgotten all this, it's time for the provinces to put them in their place. You little authoritarian, you. Are you sure you're not American, Jamie? This is more than colonial apologia. This is nothing more, sorry. This is nothing more than colonial apologia, posing as social criticism. Like it or not, people like Jamie Sarkonak are settler colonial white supremacists, defenders of a system that has been and still is responsible for the mass ethnic cleansing, dispossession, surveillance, and genocide of Indigenous peoples here in Canada and the United States. It's still going on to this day. The uncomfortable truth for people like Jamie Sarkonak is that anti-Indigenous racism is the norm among non-Indigenous populations in Canada. That's why you're getting so upset about this, and that's why you think you can get other people upset. This is because anti-Indigenous racism is baked into the foundations of this country. Anti-Indigenous racism is an inheritance from European colonization. That's why we want to change street names. That's why we want to change systems. If you want to see this for yourself, if you want to see the colonial bigotry on display among Canadian people, check the comment section from Sarkonak's op-ed, which I have posted in the video description below. It's not pretty. Ignorant and incurious Canadians like Jamie Sarkonak can plug their ears and close their eyes, but denialism and obfuscation can't make the truth disappear. You want to make street signs, disappear. You want to make the name changes and the rethinking of colonial practices. You want to make that disappear? Sorry, not going to happen. Instead of providing racist propaganda to the billionaire US hedge fund company that owns Postmedia and pays her bills, Jamie Sarkonak could do some basic research and learn a thing or two about what it's like to be Indigenous on land stolen and occupied by settler colonial white supremacists like herself. So in the spirit of discovery and re-education, I'd like to help expand Jamie Sarkonak's mind a little bit by reading an excerpt from Settlers, the Mythology of the White Proletariat from Mayflower to Modern by the legendary J Sakai. If you've never heard of J Sakai, if you don't know his work, watch what comes next. It's really, really important for us to understand where we come from and whose land we're on. Because then we could understand why we need to incorporate those people who were originally here rather than pretending that they speak dead languages and that they wouldn't even understand it themselves. That is colonial apologia, Jamie. So let's hear from the legendary J Sakai. Let's enjoy this footage, which I shot again all the way back on Canada Day, but come on, isn't it appropriate? The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical moment waned. For the English settlers, this conquest made real the bourgeois visions of building a whole new European society. Like many such fixes, for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. This consequence is a material fact of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the above here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settlers' societies throw off the propaganda smokescreen that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and the pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," unquote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by the white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kind of tales any less preposterous when put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived in Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretched from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in central Mexico, with an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and Southern America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians that once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the USA. That was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The final solution to the Indian problem was so widely expected by whites that it was openly spoken of as a commonplace thing, at the turn of the century, a newspaper as respectable as the New York Times could editorially threaten that those peoples who opposed the New World capitalist order would be extinguished like the North American Indian. Only a relative handful of Indians survived the time of the Great Extermination campaigns. You see, the land wasn't empty after all, and for America and Canada to exist, the settlers had to deliberately make the land empty. Only a relative handful of Indians survived the time of the Great Extermination campaigns. You see, the land wasn't empty after all, and for America to exist, the settlers had to deliberately make the land empty. And of course, if you think that that didn't happen here in Canada, boy, I have some news for you. When the American West was settled, many of the most virulent, most violent settlers actually came north to Canada, to the prairies, because there was less settlement up there. So, in fact, actually, Alberta, Saskatchewan, some places in Manitoba were settled by some of the worst American genociders. So it's little surprise that all these years later, we still have pockets of virulent pro-colonial ideology. People like Jamie Sarkonak. It's a pity we don't have more people like J Sakai. It's a pity we don't have more people who have their eyes open to the realities of this country. But if you'd like to learn more and if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe and we'll see you in another video. Ciao for now.